to be sitting in the auditory driver's seat. I'm going to be teaching this introduction to Hegel class today, which is designed for beginners. Jenny's going to be teaching on Friday when she teaches her class.
Yes.
This is also half a year since we launched our Patreon, which is sort of a big deal. And to
I feel like I should have confetti. I'm not going to throw coffee on you instead.
Yeah, you could do that. And to celebrate half a year of being on Patreon, I've made the entire article that this class is based on free for everybody. Well, free, I mean, for anyone who's a patron, so across all of our tiers. And if you would like to download this class and all of our classes as an audio file, if you'd like to download the bonus discussions that we host as an audio file, if you'd like to have access to our lecture notes, if you'd like to watch our master classes, you can find all of that on our Patreon. There's a link in bio or on the About page on YouTube. It really helps us keep this project going, and it also makes it so that we can make the main event, the classes, these lectures, these live streams, sort of just open to everybody. Because that's sort of the idea that Julian and I had, is that we want to make philosophy and political economy as accessible to everybody and to make it hopefully easy to understand without dumbing it down. That was our goal, to make it accessible without making it dumb. And to sort of give everybody the benefit of the doubt that actually complexity is more rewarding and more satisfying. So if you're joining us for the first time today, welcome. It is our pleasure to be teaching you. Jenlene and I both used to work in the United Kingdom. Jenlene worked as an academic at the University of London. I used to work at the University of Oxford Brookes. The pandemic forced us to beat a retreat back to the United States, and we started teaching here online. If you're joining us for the very first time, so I just want to say welcome. If you're a beginner, that's totally fine. Anybody can join. It makes us very happy knowing that there are people joining us from around the world. Hello to Brazil, for example. Falo pouquinho em português. But it would be great if you guys in the comments could post to us where you're joining us from. That always makes us very happy. And okay, I think we should just dive right in today.
Yes.
So what are we going to be talking about? We're going to be talking about 4 different ways of looking at the world and what that tells us about Hegel. I know that's super abstract, but we're just going to sort of take it from there. And if you're new to these classes, I want you to know that I tried to use a lot of examples that are intuitive. So you don't need to have a whole bunch of theory. Someone says, hello from Holland. Ik spreek ook Nederlands. Ik spreek Portuguese and ik spreek Nederlands. It's funny. I don't speak all the languages that are in the chat here. It just happens to be that those are 2 of the languages that I speak. Okay, and okay, so I want to start on the topic of empathy. The topic of empathy. Because today, we often think of empathy as, I mean, do you have a definition of empathy that comes to mind, like a popular definition?
Yeah, like feeling like you are understanding the suffering that someone else is going through.
Exactly, right? We think of empathy as having the emotional imagination that you can understand the pain of others. And we think of that as a good thing, I mean, understandably, because...
Like a capacity.
Exactly, that people can experience pain. Exactly, that's what we consider to be empathy. And we can experience empathy in many different ways. We can experience empathy by meeting people in real life, by watching movies, by reading books, going to plays. There's many ways in which we can be empathetic towards other people's experiences. Now, that's the commonplace, popular conception of empathy. But if you go back to Theodor Lipps, who is one of the founding fathers of psychoanalysis, one of the main influences on Freud, Theodor Lipps had a very different theory of empathy, which he called Einfühlung. I mean, that's the German word for it, Einfühlung, to feel into something. And for Theodor Lipps, empathy is not that you understand, that you feel other people's pain in you. It's that you feel your own pain in others. It's the exact opposite. It's not that you're saying, I see that you have pain and I experience your pain. That's not what he calls empathy. He says it's the exact reverse of that, which is that I experience my own pain in other people or through other people, which is in a sense how reading works and how theater works. It's how for the Greeks catharsis works. The idea that in a sense you experience, you find a language for your own suffering in the suffering of others. And what's important for Lipps is that that doesn't have to be other people. It can also be objects. You can also have empathy for objects in that sense. Like you can go into an art gallery, or you could read a book, or you could watch a movie, and you could see a reflection of your own suffering in the suffering of others. And of course, that's what's so beautiful about reading. That's what's so beautiful about watching movies. Any kind of artistic enterprise or experience is that you realize that the emotion that you thought was unique to you, something that only you go through, is actually something that is universal to the human experience. And so in a weird way, you understand yourself better by means of understanding that what you thought was exclusive to you is also happening to other people. But in a sense, it seems selfish, right?
Yeah, it's simultaneously comforting and really disturbing to feel like everyone else is experiencing, that your emotions and your experiences are just what everyone else is going through.
Yeah, and at the same time, you could think of it as selfish, right? You could basically say, if my empathy for others simply serves the discovery of my own self, is it really empathy? And at the same time, you could say that's the only form of empathy, because what is worse is a detached form of empathy. Because it's not really empathy if you say, I empathize with you, but I feel no internal stakes in what you're going through. And of course, that's also sort of how empathy has become less important today, is the idea that we say we have empathy for people, but at the same time, having empathy becomes a way to keep them separate from us.
Yeah, like a distancing.
Exactly. When we empathize with someone, in a weird way, means that we don't have to identify with their suffering. We can put it into another place. And so we have here, if you want to go back to Theodor Lipps, one of the founding fathers of psychoanalysis, who I otherwise don't mention very often because I don't go back to him very frequently. He has a lot of limitations, is that he's essentially positing empathy, or Einfühlung, as a transcendental category. And what I mean by that is that he's positing empathy not just as I understand the pain of others, and not just I see my own pain in others, but saying that I discover myself by means of realizing that there's a reflection of my own suffering in the experience of other people. And so it's a self-discovery. And that's kind of an important idea, because one of the things, going back to previous class, that Kant is obsessed with is what can we really know and what can we not know? And to what extent is our own subjective experience determined by things that are outside of our perception? Now, to go back to Kant for a moment, I think there's a couple things that I want to say, and I also put this in the masterclass, for those of you who watch the masterclass. For Kant, the subject, the individual, can be two things. Either the subject can be productive, the individual can be productive, or the individual can be perceptive. For Kant, you can't actually really be both at the same time. You're either productive or perceptive. Now, today when we think about productivity, we think you're like building something or doing something or writing something. And what Kant meant by productivity is actually closer to what today we would think as non-productive. For him, it was thinking. Thinking was very productive for Kant. It was a category of production. Now, why is that? It's because when you're thinking, you're creating mental images in your mind in order to create an understanding or a vision of reality. But that is a productive experience or a productive category, because when you're using mental images, in other words, when you're using concepts, you're doing something that you produce. In other words, your mind, your intellect, your reason is producing the categories of the world. And that is productive for Kant. And the opposite of that for Immanuel Kant is the idea of the receptive subject. And the receptive subject would essentially take the world in as it is. That's the famous idea of the Kantian Ding an sich, the thing in itself. Of course, as Kant already well knew, there's a certain paradox here, because they seem to be mutually opposed. And I mean, Hegel, of course, also was very aware of this in his critique of Kant, is that you can't actually think about a perceptive subject without mediating it through reason. In other words, if we have a difference between intellect, on the one hand, the productive thinking subject, intellect, reason, versus the perceptive, non-rational subject who's taking the world in as it is, which Kant calls intuition, you actually can only understand intuition as a category of the intellect itself. Intuition is an intellectual category because as soon as we think about intuition, we've done something productive, which is that we've created a mental image or a concept of intuition. Pure intuition is not something that we can represent through an intellectual category. And this is where, does that make sense?
Yeah.
This is where Kant and Hegel totally differ. Because Kant sees that as a problem. It means we cannot get to pure intuition. Because as soon as we make intuition into a mental category, it's no longer intuition. Hegel's correction of Kant, or radicalization of Kant, is to say that is the only way to experience intuition. Intuition only exists as a category of the intellect. There's no such thing as pure intuition before intellectual mediation. And we'll talk more about that and what that means in this class, because that's going to be a running theme or running gag, I don't know what we want to call it, throughout the class. But first, go back to empathy for a moment. I want to take two different ways in which Theodor Lips's theory of Einfühlung, empathy, was adapted by two different thinkers. And one of the thinkers was the Austrian poet Rilke. That's right. You have to be German to pronounce that name, or Austrian.
Yeah.
Rilke, R-I-L-K-E. And the other one is Sigmund Freud. Two Austrians with very different understandings of empathy. And Rilke was a poet. He was a romantic poet who studied with Rodin, the French sculptor Rodin, and was a disciple of Rodin. And if you know anything about Rodin, you know that Rodin, his own revolution in sculpting was to say, I'm not going to have a representation of how things appear in the world to us. This is not a classical definition of beauty. Instead, I'm going to have a representation of the essence of something. So if I'm going to do a sculpture, for example, of Balzac, I'm not going to do Balzac in like his glorious pose. Instead, I'm going to do what really cuts to the core of Balzac, which is Balzac in his bathrobe at his own home, drinking 20 cups of coffee in the middle of the night, scribbling all the Balzacian stories, right? Or, I mean, the famous one is a panther. Like, Rodin has a panther, which Rilke wrote a poem about called The Panther, very famous, where the idea is that he wanted to create the essence of the movement of a panther pacing in front of a cage in a sculpture, rather than the classical, I'm a panther. Anyway, so Rilke had a theory of empathy, a theory which for him was a romantic theory of Einsehen, which means seeing into something, which he took from Rodin. And what he would do, again, which he'd been taught by Rodin, was to go to the zoo. And he would go to the zoo, and for hours and hours and hours, he would simply look at the animals. And he tried to, like, get to the essence of the animal experience. Like, he'd sort of try to see into their soul. And again, sort of similar to Lips, it wasn't just animals or other people. It was also objects. Like, he would look at a stone. He would look at a stone so long and so intensively at a stone until he felt like the barrier between himself and the stone had become immaterial. He had become the stone. Very zen, very romantic. Not something that Freud would in any way have advocated. Because what would Freud have pointed out immediately is that Rilke was making the typically romantic misassumption. In other words, he has an assumption that he's not acknowledging, which is that he assumes a priori that there is an essence to the stone, and that there's an essence to him, and that they exist separately, and that there is a transcendental way for the artist or the poet to actually reach into the essence of the stone, or the panther, or the animal. And Freud would have immediately argued that it's not so much that there is an other to us, it's that the other is already in us, in a sense. Anyway, don't want to go too fast here. Freud's theory of empathy is not Einsehen, it's not seeing into, it's Zusehen, which means to, it's hard to translate, but it means to look towards, or to look at, I suppose you could say. It's not really looking at, it's to look towards. The metaphor that Freud has it's very Proustian. He says, there's a man in a train, and everybody who's been in a train knows what this like is. You're in the train, and you're sort of leaning your head against the window, and while you're in the train, you appear to be static. And yet the world is just barreling past you. The world is going very fast. And the world is going so fast that, in a sense, you can't really see it. It becomes a blur. It becomes impressionistic. You look out, if you take a photograph of what it looks like to be in a train looking out the window, it's just It's just a green blur. And there's a particular reversal that takes place here, which is that when we're in a train looking outside, we think that we are the ones that are static and that everything is outside is in motion. But of course, it's the exact other way around. We're moving really fast to the point that we think we're static, and outside everything is in motion. Everything is static. Sorry, God, it's like I hate it when I get these things mixed up. Yeah, exactly. We're sitting in the train, and everything is moving, which is why we think we're still, and the world is static, but it appears to us in motion. And what Freud's pointing towards here is that there's a certain inversion when it comes to experience as such. We never actually take reality in, strictly speaking, as it is. We're almost in like a, I don't know, we're almost like in a bit of an Einstein world here, right?
Yeah, and it's almost as though what that metaphor actually suggests is that we see the opposite rather than we see the thing that is similar.
Yeah, it's a little bit like when we have a camera that it's like a lens, like a DSLR camera, where the reason that we see the image upright is because it's already being bounced back towards us. Of course, that's also the metaphor for how selfhood is experienced within the Freudian psychoanalytic selfhood, is that selfhood is experienced as a result of the refraction of the other within ourselves. We anticipate the other. Sartre's hell is other people, and so on.
So can I just ask, so for Freud, is there no such thing as empathy? There's only refraction of particular aspects of the self?
Yes and no. So I'll get to that right now. So Freud, I mean, because this theory by itself, the Zusein, doesn't really tell us anything. Like, there's no metaphysical purpose to this. And someone in the comments just said that this makes sense, and that's great. That makes me very happy, because I'm always worried that it doesn't make sense. But I try to make it, hopefully, intuitive. So Freud doesn't just have, I mean, he has many concepts and many theories, but one of them is indifference. Indifference. Now, indifference is the opposite of empathy. However, it's usually translated totally wrong as indifference. And it's not indifference. The word indifference for Freud is specifically not indifference. It's the absence of difference, which is something very different. To be indifferent is not an absence of difference. And I'll explain it like this. I know this is a little bit different.
No.
But it's important.
It's interesting.
Well, thank you. There's something more interesting happening here, which is that the concept of indifference, the absence of difference, helps you understand what Freud's famous therapeutic practice is, which is the talking therapy. Now, one thing that we don't get when we go in to see the therapist, even though this might surprise you, we don't go in for empathy. We don't go to the therapist for empathy. We specifically go to the therapist for an absence of empathy. Because the problem with empathy is that it's part of the chain of signification. We want to be understood, but we also feel misunderstood. And the reason that the therapist will not misunderstand you is because they will also not understand you. Now, I realize that sounds like a rhetorical game, so let me explain it just a little bit more. Let's stick with the train metaphor, but let's extend it. If the train is a metaphor for expression, and we are on the tracks of, I don't know, language, symbolic order, the therapist couch is the station that the train comes into. You're going. There's no end to it. You're constantly explaining yourself, being understood, being misunderstood. You're explaining yourself to yourself. You have a narrative in your head, or you're telling it to others, or
and that's just sort of laying down the tracks in front of the train.
Exactly. You're just going, and you're constantly taking in new visions and emotions, and then you get into the trains and you hit that bumper at the end of the tracks, and there's a short circuit, which is that in a sense you're coming home, and you're not coming home to be understood or to be empathized with. When you come to the therapist couch, or at least to the Freudian therapist couch, you're coming to a barrier. The barrier is the barrier of indifference. It's not saying, I don't care about you. It's saying there is an absence of difference. There's no possibility to be misunderstood here. The therapist exists as a barrier to the chain of signification. It's a little bit like when people say that if you want to get rid of your emotions, you should write them down on paper. Or if you're really angry, you type out an angry email and then you don't send it. This is the not sending of the emotion, is you go to the therapist couch. It doesn't go anywhere. It's like you shoot it, it fizzles out. There's no consequence necessarily to going to the therapist's couch. And this is also important because the talking therapy, and from a Freudian perspective, it's not that you uncover some hidden truth about yourself, because that would still be hysterical in a sense. It's specifically about getting to a short circuit where there is no secret truth to be uncovered. It's like a break almost in that sense. Okay, anyway, so we have here the two different, or three, if you will, three different ways of looking at the idea of empathy. We have the Kantian idea of the productive or the perceptive individual, right? The productive individual is the one who's thinking the world in mental images, creating the world through concepts. The receptive individual is the individual who is simply taking the world in as it is, which Kant doesn't think is possible. He thinks the only person who can actually do this is God. This is also why the German mathematician Jacobi made fun, ironically, of Kant by saying, Kant is the sloth of reason. And then in brackets, thank God, ironically. Because in a sense, and Hegel already pointed this out, there's a passage in Hegel where he specifically accuses Kant of being the first anti-philosopher. He says, the Kantian logic would imply a philosophy without metaphysics. In other words, a philosophy in which we cannot actually ourselves know the truth. If the truth remains behind a barrier, if the essence of things is behind a barrier that only God can traverse, then what's the point of philosophy? And that's exactly what Jacobi's joke is. He says, the sloth of reason is Kant, because he tells us, actually, we don't need to philosophize. I mean, Kant doesn't say this. This is what Jacobi is saying. We don't actually have to philosophize because we're never going to reach the end point, in a sense. And then he says, thank God, because it's almost like God said, don't bother trying because you won't be able to actually get there. And so that's one approach to it. The other approach is Rilke's idea of einsehen, or seeing into. And then we have Freud's idea of zusehen, or seeing unto something, in a sense. Okay, now we can finally get to Hegel's version of seeing. Because Hegel has his own description. It's in the, I think it's like the philosophy of spirit, which is part of the Jena lectures. Again, this is in my lecture. There's a whole, you can read the whole passage in the article that I posted on Patreon. And Hegel calls it not einsehen, and he doesn't call it zusehen, he calls it anschauen. Now, anschauen is a regular German word. It simply means to look at something. For example, if there's a statue, you could look at the statue. There's a woman or a man, you could look at them from a distance. Anschauen simply means to take something in. But the taking in is really important here because, again, we for those of you who are a little bit aware of Hegel and familiar with Hegel is, and Zizek has made fun of this. Zizek always calls Hegel like the constipated philosopher because he's always taking things in and then like the thing is already there somehow. There's too much of it. You know, it's also why Hegel, when we say Hegel's a Christian philosopher, it's constipated specifically in the sense of like the sacred rite in Christianity, which is the bread is my body and the wine is my blood. Is that, you know what I mean? The transfiguration, all that stuff. Anyway, Hegelian Anschauung. So to look at something, but to take something in. Let's call it to take something in. I mean, there's probably a proper translation, but this is mine. To take something in takes place in 4 steps. 4 steps. Although, as per usual with Hegel, it's also really 5 steps because the first step turns out to already be the 5th. In other words, the first and the 4th steps are themselves the 5th steps. But this is, let's not get too technical. Let's give it easy. To take something in, to look at something, goes in 4 steps.
Can I just say,
Yeah.
I feel like there should be like a Hegel cookbook or something
Yeah.
where it's like constantly referring back to and repeating steps. Yes.
This is also my Hegel. Like this is Julian's Hegel. I'll admit to that. But I mean, one of the things that I always want to stress when it comes to Hegel, and I think like this is like a really good starting point, is that Hegel doesn't really believe in logical sequences in terms of like forward progression. So when I say 1, 2, 3, 4, I never really mean 1,
First,
2,
second, third.
3, 4. And even if you go to Hegel's Logic, which I mean Hegel only wrote 2 serious books: The Phenomenology of Spirit and The Logic. The rest is just like him explaining himself, basically. Those books you have to go through to really understand them, and which I haven't fully done in a sense. Like, I mean, I'm still trying to figure it out. So when you say 1, 2, 3, 4, it's not saying you start from A and you go to, like, it's not your moving, you're not going up a mountain, you're not moving towards anything. There's no linear progression in Hegel. But anyway, I'm trying to get to the point.
Okay.
The point is, if there are 4 steps when you take something in, 4 steps when you look at something, they can be summed up very easily. 1, the looking. To look at something, you have to look at it. You have to direct your attention to the thing. Pretty obvious. This is Hegel at his most commonsensical, which is perfect because it's always when Hegel does common sense that it gets really difficult. No, this is actually this is also like when Heidegger says, you know, on the very first page of Sein und Zeit, he says we have to go back to the question of being. We have to go back to common sense. It's like you want to go a little bit like, well, screw you, because you know that as soon as a philosopher starts talking about common sense, it's going to be the exact opposite. So Hegel starts with 1. In order to look at something, you have to direct your attention to it. You have to look at it. 2, what does it mean to look at something? It means to create a mental image of that thing in your mind. I am seeing it. It becomes a part of me. And this is where, again, Hegel becomes the constipated thinker, as Zizek would put it. It's like, at this point, Hegel says that you have imbibed the thing that existed. Like, let's say you're looking at a rock. Rock is just, I'm a rock. I'm chilling. I'm in the world. And then you look at it, and then it's like you've devoured the rock. This also has resonances with a lot of different theological practices and how iconoclasm works. The idea that like you cannot depict, for example, if you don't depict the prophet, it's because no one can imbibe the prophet in that sense. And of course, in Christianity, it's the exact opposite. It's like, yeah, everybody should be eating the prophet. Here's Jesus, eat him every time you go to church. And no, but I know I'm joking, but like, there's an intentional inversion of the entire logic that takes place here. It's like, yes, again, in the previous class, I talked a lot about the Christian logic in Hegel, and hopefully that comes through here as well. So you're imbibing it. You're, in a sense, internalizing it. When you look at something, you're internalizing it. So step 1 is you look at something. You direct your attention to it. Step 2 is you make that thing an image in yourself. You've taken the thing into yourself. Now, the third part is that the image in you is now also you, if that makes sense. Now the image that I have of myself is also including that thing which I have taken into me. Right?
Yeah.
I have a mental image of it because I've seen it. And the fourth and the most wacky moment in Hegel's logic of seeing is that spirit, what do you call spirit, looks at itself. And he almost describes it as like spirit like comes out of you and looks at you looking at a thing. It's like this exteriorization. We don't take that literally. It's not like there's a Holy Ghost who's like pondering. It's also not a panopticon. I mean, it's almost a panopticon here. It's like I'm looking at something, but spirit is watching me looking at something. And that's not really what Hegel has in mind. Again, the fourth point, the spirit watching itself, is already the first point. And what he means by that is, in order to direct your attention to something, to look at it, to take it in, you've already created a mental image of the world in which there is something to direct your attention to. It's not like the stone is saying, look at me. I'm a stone. I want you to look at me. You've created a mental image of concepts around you that you're looking at. And so you've done the looking before you're doing the looking. You've already done it, in a sense. And that's what he calls spirit. We're simplifying here. But one of the ways in which Hegel often describes absolute knowing is thought thinking itself, which is like the highest category of knowing. And this is a lower form of that, which is sight seeing itself. Very abstract, so let's use some examples. Let's have some examples to clarify this. So far, so good?
Yeah.
Okay. It's kind of hot in the car. I'm gonna open the door a little bit.
I'm sorry.
Okay, so I have an example that I want to use to hopefully clarify this a little bit. And it's a children's story. I wish I could remember the name of the author. It's an Italian communist children's writer. His name is Gianni something. It's in the article. There's a whole quote. And it's a children's story that, I don't know, do you know this children's story? I'll tell it anyway.
Tell it and we'll see if I remember.
Okay, so the children's story goes like this. There's an old lady and an old man, and they're, I don't know, in Italy, on the balcony, watching children play in the courtyard. And the children have an invented language, and they're just speaking in this invented language to each other. And the woman says, these kids these days, they make no sense. They're just speaking in tongues. And the old man looks towards the woman and he says, no, I speak this language too. And she says, oh, really? You speak the language of the children? And he says, yep, I took a degree in this language. And she says, so what are they saying? And he says, they're talking about how beautiful the world is. They're just saying briff, bruff, briff, essentially. And he's saying, they're talking about how beautiful the world is. And then she's saying, really? I want to know what makes the world beautiful. And the man looks at the children. And I'm not telling this very well, but he looks towards the woman and he says, the world is beautiful because briff, bruff, bruff. And he's basically just speaking the invented language. And, okay, a couple of things here. There's a joke, a Jewish joke that Zizek uses that has the same logic here. And it's one of those Jewish anti-Semitic jokes, which is that there's two Jews who are walking through the street on their way to the synagogue. And they pass by a Christian church. And they say, why would I ever go to a Christian church? And and then they realize that at the Christian church, they're actually handing out like free money. And so one of the Jews says, oh, free money, I'm going to go inside and pretend that he's a Christian. So he goes into the church and he supposedly gets the free money. And then the Jew comes back outside and the other Jew says, so did they give you the money? And he's like, you Jews, all you can ever think about is money, right? It's like this reversal that takes place here. He's absorbed the language of the Christian church, including its anti-Semitism towards Jews, retroactively affirming the very reason why he went in the first place, right? It's one of those beautifully complicated Jewish jokes. And what's important to understand here is that it's the same logic fundamentally as in the Italian story about the children.
Yeah.
And there's two interpretations of this story that we should reject. It's not that the children, because they are children, have access to some truth of the world, some beauty of the world that we don't have.
Yeah, that's why it's important to pair those two jokes together. Yeah.
Exactly. They don't have access to any kind of truth. It's not that there's this idea that children have like a more naive understanding of the world and they can access the inner truth and the beauty of the world. And when we grow up, we've lost the truth. No, that's not what's being pointed out here. And the second mistake is the mistake that the woman makes, which is that she wants to know what is the translation for why the world is beautiful. Except there is no translation for why the world is beautiful. The only reason the world is beautiful is because of its expression in the invented language. It's lost in translation in that sense. And at the same time, it's through that loss that it retroactively emerges. Because the beauty of the world can only be expressed as briff, bruff, briff. There's no explanation of briff, bruff, briff that would represent an a priori beauty of the world. The invented language is itself the expression of the beauty of the world in that which cannot be accessed.
Yeah.
Okay, this is
It's the Schumann anecdote of premiering a piece. I think it was Schumann. And someone asked him, oh, that was so beautiful, but what does it mean? And he sits down and plays it again. It's the idea that there isn't an underlying meaning. The thing itself is the meaning.
Yeah, exactly. And it's specifically, yes, I mean, that's a really nice way to put it. That's a really good example. I like that. Because the Kantian logic here, Kant reveals himself to be like the old lady. So what is the truth? I want to know what the translation of essence is. And what does briff, bruff, briff mean? And something is being kept from me. And it's behind something. And I want to get to that. And Hegel's insight over and over again is say there's nothing beyond or behind appearance itself. Essence is not barred by appearance. In other words, the truth of the world isn't hidden from us through the external appearance of objects. The essence is appearance as appearance itself. And that can be a little bit difficult, so I want to try to explain that a little bit more. Essence is appearance itself. We've looked at Rilke's form of Einsehen, Freud's form of Zusehen, and Hegel's form of Anschauen. And I think that we should add to this Hegel's version, not Hegel, sorry, Freudian slip. Zizek's version of looking at the world, which is the famous ideology glasses. We put on the glasses of ideology and we see the world around us as it supposedly is. Now, the reason that Zizek always talks about the ideology glasses, as many of you probably know from watching his movie about it, is that he's referenced, and Zizek takes most of his examples from popular culture and genre movies in particular. And in this case, he takes it from John Carpenter's film, They Live. And in John Carpenter's film, They Live, there's a homeless man called Nada, which means nothing, as Spanish-speaking people here will know. He, in a sense, has no name. There's a broader plot, and it's a silly movie, but who discovers in the trash a pair of glasses. And when he puts on those glasses, he essentially sees ideology. He sees the unspoken, underlying, subliminal messages that are being broadcast to you, whether it's through advertising, whether it's in the news media, etc. But here's a very important distinction between the cynic or the paranoid and someone who critiques ideology. The cynic maintains the world of ideology because the cynic infers too much meaning in ideology, in the same way that the paranoid always finds too much meaning. Everything happens for a reason. Look around you. There's evidence of conspiracy everywhere. It all makes sense when you connect all the dots and red yarns. The cynic and the paranoid imbues too much meaning into the system, thereby in a weird way legitimizing the system. And this is also why Kant is fundamentally a paranoid cynic. Because he says, everything makes sense and everything happens for a reason and everything has a predetermined, pure, fundamental form of idea and essence. And God has made it thus. And in a sense, that is what prevents him from taking the next logical step, because that's where you become the Jacobian sloth of reason. You actually don't have to think for yourself because you've said that everything has already been thought for you by something else. In this case, God. Not to say that Hegel's a secular thinker at all, right? I mean, it's that's not the point. And so when you put on the glasses in John Carpenter's movie of They Live, when you put on the glasses, you start seeing you don't see the underlying content. You don't see, oh, they're actually trying to tell us this. You're simply made aware of the form of the content. In other words, the messages now appear in their most direct statement. So a billboard becomes, this is what we want you to want. A newspaper becomes, this is what we want you to fear, etc. We start seeing a more direct representation of how the form relates to the content, as it were. So there's less obfuscation. And this is also why the critique of ideology always has to be, I think I've said this many times before, I hope, the critique of ideology boils down in philosophical terms to the identification of the content of the form itself. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time going over form and content. I've done that in previous classes. You can dig deeper into that if you want. You don't have to, obviously. It's sort of, I don't want it to be self-indulgent in that sense. But if you will, the content of something has to be expressed in a form. And the idea is that, and this is the insight that Freud has, it's the insight that Hegel has, it's the insight that Marx has. If you want to understand the history of continental philosophy, this is what you have to understand. It's the awareness that there is a content to the form itself. Now let's go back to Kant, to the idea that we have the division between the subject and the object, the productive thinker of mental categories and the perceptive recipient of pure forms or essences. We already discovered for Kant that these are in a sense tautological. What he presents as an opposition, the productive thinker and the perceptive intuition of pure truth, is already an impossibility, that we can only know intuition as a category of the intellect itself. And so what we've already done is we've taken Kantian formalism, whatever, Kant knew this and Hegel just radicalized it, the Kantian formalism, which functions as a paradox, and we've simply said that it's not just tautological, but that there's a content to the form itself. In other words, to make it very technical, what we said is that Hegel takes the gap between intellect and intuition and transposes that gap back into the subject himself. In other words, the gap retroactively is also the thing itself. There is no object before this gap. There is no truth behind the world except this gap. If you will, you could say, if Kant asked Hegel, what is the beauty of the world? Hegel's response would be, briff, bruff, bruff, essentially. There is nothing behind briff, bruff, bruff to be translated except the expression of the intranslatability itself. Now, understandably, that feels a little bit like a cop-out, you could say. You could say that Hegel simply says, he simply transposes the impossibility into a form of success. So let's take a final look at that and see if we can unravel why this is important. What Hegel is essentially positing here is that when you see something as missing, that is actually a determinate reflection of the thing itself. If you go all the way up to Husserl has indeterminate and determinate reflection. And this is the dialectic of presence and absence in Christianity. Something exists to us by means of our awareness that it is not there. In Freud, the version of this in Freud is the castration complex. It's the idea that we have lost something that is still there. It's just the inversion of that. And so within the Christian ethic, which Hegel's always adapting for his own purposes here, I mean, all philosophers, in a sense, all the Christian philosophers, all the transcendental philosophers are adapting this. We have, and this is from the previous class, if we have the figure of God, and the figure of God, in a sense, actualizes through the Trinity, the way in which this happens is through a loss of God, because that's what Christ is. Christ coming to earth is a loss of the absolute and the absolute deity and of the eternal Father and that figure, as I think I said many times in the previous lectures. And so, in a sense, God did not exist to begin with, at least not the Christian God, before God's fall and the resurrection of Christ and the emergence of the Holy Spirit. And that is the same logic that Hegel introduces for Kant. Rather than saying that there is a barrier between man and God, or if you will, between man and the absolute, and that it is our goal to somehow reach beyond that barrier, he simply transposes that barrier back into God himself, back into the absolute itself, which is now that there is no absolute, save for the absolute, which became reducted from itself, and it is through human subjectivity that the absolute emerges how it always should have been. And this is where Hegel is once again, if we go back to the idea of empathy, Hegel's again a chiastic thinker. Because if the chiastic structure is A, B, B, A, with X being the middle point, again, there's no logical sequence, there's no A, B, B, A, there's simply A, B, X, B, A, right? It's moving like this instead of like this. If you have A being the essence of the object, B being the image of the object, X is the subject, and then B is the image of the subject to himself, and then essence is the essence of the subject to himself. Emerging only, the essence of the subject emerges only to the extent that the essence of the object is lost, and the essence of the object only emerges to the extent that the essence of the subject is lost. They are both coming into focus by means of their simultaneous loss. This is why Hegel's Anschauung, which takes place in 4 steps, is not a consecutive sequence of steps. If it were, he would be making the same mistake of logic that Rilke made. The idea that there's an essence to my subjectivity that can delve into the essence of a rock or an animal in the zoo. And that's exactly what Hegel doesn't think. He's saying, there is no essence to me or an essence to the rock or the object of the animal. It is that the essence retroactively emerges as the mutual loss of either of them in their mediation. If that does that make sense? I know this is like very technical at this point.
No, it's
And this is also why you start understanding why for Hegel the 4th category, which is also the 5th because it's the 1st and the 4th at the same time, is, we talked about this in like a panopticon way. It's the looking at itself. It's the awareness of certain externalization of the absolute coming into being through a sequence of events, or a not consecutive, but we should invent a word here, like the intrasecutive sequence of events, that brings about the very thing that we thought was lost. And so, again, it's not that we're lost in translation. It's that in translation, we are.
That's
And
what, yeah.
does that, I feel like this is, I know this is, to me that makes sense, but I hope maybe I'm not explaining that particularly well in Hegel. And so this is where you can start understanding why Zizek's emphasis on ideology is so distinctly Hegelian. Because if ideology is the awareness, the analysis, the critique of the content of the form itself, it's about saying not what is the underlying message. It's not saying what does the ruling class want us to think. It's how does the thought of the ruling class, which it wants us to think, emerge in the first place.
Right.
We're actually no longer just looking at the subjective emergence of things as they are in the world, which would be a form of paranoia or cynicism.
Yeah.
Instead, we're looking into the conditions that created the logical sequence by which we were meant to think those things in the first place.
Yeah, so it's like trying to look at that X point rather than just look at the A point. The cynic just looks at the A point and says,
Yeah.
you just need to take off your glasses and then you'll be able to see the A point without any kind of filter.
The most ideological
yeah.
thing you can do is to say that you are the one who is waking up to ideology. That is how you stay within the realm of ideology. That's not actually what it means to critique ideology. Every podcast you go on to where people tell you about how you should wake up and how you should like see the truth, and the media is just telling you this, and then they want to sell you supplements and I don't know, stuff like that. Those people are keeping you within the ideological circulation, because the ideology contains its own resistance in that sense. Because simply critiquing the underlying truth won't undo the system. It's once you start understanding the content with which the system, the content of the form itself, why the system expresses itself in that way, that you can understanding what is symptomatic to that system. And this is also why, I mean, we're trying to cram too much in here, which is why probably it seems a little bit obtuse. This is also exactly what Freud's dream analysis then becomes, which rests on the ideas of empathy and difference, which is that you're not looking for the content of the dream. The concept of the dream is not very interesting. Could be unicorns, could be sex, could be anything. It's specifically the content of the form of the dream. Why are you dreaming the dream in this particular way? It's not the what of the dream, it's the how of the dream. And that's what the critique of ideology is. And so that's, in a sense, the innovation that Hegel has upon Kant as well. Is he's saying we're not looking for the hidden content behind the form. Because for Kant, the form prevents us from getting to the content. We're stuck within the formalism of the Kantian antinomies. And we can't get beyond that.
Yeah, I think that's really important to point out that the thing is acting as a barrier in a sense. It's not...
And Hegel says the form isn't a barrier. We have to look for the content in the form itself. And so he brings it back into the form. And that's also why, if you want to understand Freud, if you want to understand Marx, if you want to understand Zizek, you have to understand that what the critique of ideology becomes, which is the looking at the content of the form, is specifically a continuation of the Hegelian turn. And this is one of the funny things about Kant's transcendentalism, is that ultimately it's not so transcendental. And this is why you should see Hegel not as a refutation of Hegel. Hegel's not a refutation of Kant. He's not saying Kant is wrong, we have to go another way. He's just saying Kant didn't realize the true consequences of his discovery. He was making a Copernican turn, right? Putting primacy on the object, primacy on the subject over the object. What we create in our mind is creating the world. That was the Kantian insight. And yet he saw that as a barrier, as a dead end. And Hegel said, actually, we just have to go through that. It's actually not a barrier. The problem becomes its own solution. And so Hegel stays within the transcendental horizon of Kant. He doesn't oppose Kant. That's also why when we talk about continental theory today and the tradition that goes from Freud to Marx and all that stuff, we see it as emerging with the Kantian turn, the Kantian split. Hegel is not Kant's enemy. He is loyal to Kant. And this is exactly what loyalty is in philosophy. Loyalty in philosophy is that you take the previous generations of thinker to the thought that they themselves could not think. It's not saying I refute you. It's funny because a lot of people even, I don't want to I'm not like a great philosopher or anything. I'm just like a popularizer. But a lot of people approach me on the internet and they say, can you tell me why this person was wrong? Or how do you refute this thinker? Because we're stuck in this this idea that what it means to be engaged in rational enlightenment debate is like prove people wrong. It's like the whole, I believe this, prove me wrong. And that's actually not how respect works within the tradition of philosophy. Within the tradition of philosophy, you're actually saying, I'm carrying the baton, not by becoming your disciple and just repeating what you're saying, but by thinking the things, the logical conclusions that you yourself could not reach. And this is where, for example, Zizek has said that all philosophers, and he's simplifying here, but he's saying that all philosophers fail to understand the most important result of their own work. The most important category, the most important insight remains a secret to them. And this is exactly how the progression of philosophy works in an idealist sense, is that that secret will not be a secret to the next generation.
Right, and it's propelled forward not because they disagree, but because there's new insight.
Yeah. And Hegel sort of jokes about this when he says that the secrets of the Egyptians were secrets to the Egyptians themselves. You never fully know or inhabit your own thought. There are parts of your own generation of thought that you cannot fully understand, or the conclusions you cannot reach. And so the definition of philosophical love and respect is to take the thought of the previous thinker and to take it to the point, to stretch it to the point where that thinker could not reach. Thinking against the grain in this sense. It's also one of the things I really dislike about Bertrand Russell, is that like in his history, and I like Bertrand Russell, I mean, there's a lot of his work that I admire, but in his, because I don't want to do the thing to him that I accuse him of doing, is that in the history of Western philosophy, he says, this is something that Plato thought that I like. This is something that he said that I don't like. And that was the whole like Cambridge, Oxford tradition of philosophy, was to say there are things that we can keep from philosophers and there are things that we have to put into the rubbish bin of history, essentially. And that's a simplification of how philosophy works. You can't just like pick in that sense.
You can't pick the brick and not the brass.
Yeah, not the, yeah, something like that. And so what Hegel is doing is he's remaining within the transcendental horizon of Kant. And he's simply driving that forward to a more radical place. In the same way that Lacan remains within the psychoanalytic horizon of Freud. Marx remains within the transcendental horizon of Hegel very much. There's a continuation of that thought. That continuation doesn't last. I mean, we will get to there eventually. Within philosophy, there's a breakdown of the transcendental horizon. There's there's something that Zizek wrote about, like in the beginning of the, I suppose it's the ticklish subject, is to say that the common enemy of all continental theory today seems to be the Cartesian subject, which is kind of funny because Kant saw himself as a savior of the Enlightenment. He wanted to save the Enlightenment from itself. He wanted to go back to the transcendental purpose of the Enlightenment, instead of saying the Enlightenment should just create more skepticism and more empiricism and more of this. This is also why Hegel, according to Zizek, but I think correctly, is also, in a sense, a Cartesian thinker, because he is trying to go back to the transcendental category of the subject. But that's even true for Theodore Lipps, where we started at the beginning of this class, because Theodore Lipps has the idea that empathy shouldn't just be about identifying pain in others. It should be about finding my pain in others, which is a much more startling insight. It's really easy to see pain in others. It's quite comforting. Like, we don't even care that, like, what's worrisome is when we see a reflection of our own pain in others. That's when pain becomes a transcendental experience. That's when empathy becomes something that has transcendental horizon, because we go beyond our own experience of self. It's very untranscendental to have empathy in the way we know it today. Yeah, I feel bad for you. I know you're going through a lot of crap. I'm going to give you a little bit of money, a donation that way, or I'm going to give a donation to a politician so the politician can worry about the problem for me. So I don't have to have empathy with refugees, but the politician can have empathy with refugees for me. We export that because the much more hazardous thing to do, and the thing that has stakes, the thing that which you risk your own being in a way that Hegel thought was very important, is specifically saying, I see my own pain in others. We think of that as being selfish, but it's the opposite of selfish. To be truly selfish is to say, I have no stake in you. Your suffering exists on an independent plane of mine, but I can imagine it. To really have skin in the game is to say, what I experience, because we're all the main characters of our world, what I experience to be the core of my life of being is something I see reflected in you. And of course, that's what love is. That's also why Hegel remains the philosopher of love. Love is to say, it's not that I love you so much It's that I see a reflection of my own love in your love and in your experience and the reformulation of that. Otherwise, it's not love, I think. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you very much for listening today. We've done a lot, but I hope that it's been a little bit clear.
Oh, that's really good.
Julian and I are going to be hosting a 1-hour Q&A immediately following this class. We're going to take a 5-minute break. Then we're going to meet you on Discord. We're actually going to go back to the Clubhouse eavesdropping channel on Discord because the lecture podium channel was confusing and not working very well. So thank you so much for joining us today. If you are joining us from around the world, I hope that you have a wonderful, wonderful day. And it's been our pleasure to host this class with you. I hope that it has been a little bit insightful, that it has opened up some doors in your thinking. That is, the goal here is not to give you conclusive answers. The goal here is to hopefully help you on your own way. And specifically, I also want to say thank you for helping us get through 6 months of Patreon. I think it's been 6 months, 5 months, 6 months, crazy. I have posted the full written article for this class, where you can find the full class as an article on Patreon for all the tiers. So whether you're in the community tier, whether you're in the masterclass tier, whether you're in the lowest tier, the highest tier, you have access to the article as of right now. We're also going to post this class as an audio recording, but most importantly, if you'd like to join our bonus Q&A, which we also record as a podcast, please send us a DM and we will help you get set up in the next 5 minutes. All right. Thank you, everybody, and we shall see you next week.
Take care.
Bye-bye.